The moving truck was already gone. The house I had lived in for 11 years stood behind me with the sheriff's notice taped to the front door. And across the street, on Marla Higgins' perfectly trimmed lawn, 5 of my former neighbors stood in a tight little circle, laughing. Not quiet, laughing. Loud, open, mocking laughter, the kind that carries on purpose. Marla actually pointed at the moving boxes stacked crooked on my cracked driveway and said, loud enough for the whole block to hear, "I guess some people just aren't cut out for Maple Grove." Her friend Denise added, maybe she should have thought about that before she started acting like she was better than the rest of us. I stood there in my work clothes, holding my daughter's hand, watching 2 men I didn't know carry my life into a truck, because the bank said I no longer had the right to call that house mine. I was 34 years old, recently widowed, and I had just lost everything in front of the same people who used to smile at me at block parties. My name is Diane Whitfield, and if you're watching this, welcome to Legacy Whisper, the channel where we tell true-to-life stories about betrayal, quiet strength, and the kind of justice that takes years to arrive, but always does. Before I tell you what happened after that day on the driveway, I want you to hit that subscribe button, because this story has a turn in it that even I didn't see coming, and I promise you, you don't want to miss where it goes. Stay with me. 3 years before that day, my husband Robert and I bought the house on Larkspur Lane with everything we had. It wasn't fancy. Small yard, single garage, a kitchen with cabinets that stuck if you didn't lift the handle just right. But it was ours, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Maple Grove was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the 4th of July meant a block party with folding tables into and down the street, and where, if you weren't careful, you learned that belonging had conditions nobody told you about upfront. Robert worked in construction management. Steady hours, decent pay, nothing glamorous, but enough. I worked part-time at a bookkeeping office while raising our daughter, Emma, who was 7 when everything started to fall apart. The trouble began quietly, the way real trouble usually does. Robert started coming home later. He said it was overtime. Then he said it was a new project downtown. Then one Tuesday morning, call came from a hospital 40 minutes away, and a voice I didn't recognize told me my husband had been in an accident on a road he had no business being on, at an hour he had no business being out, and that he hadn't survived. I won't pretend the next few months were anything but a blur of paperwork, casseroles from people who barely spoke to me at the funeral, and Emma asking me every single night why her daddy wasn't coming home. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that Robert had been quietly bleeding our savings for almost a year. Loans I never signed for. A second mortgage he took out using a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. Money moved into an account I didn't know existed. Money that vanished just as fast as it appeared. I found out about all of it only after his death, when the bills started arriving with amounts that made my hands shake. I tried everything. I sat across from bank managers who looked at me with something between sympathy and irritation, like my grief was an inconvenience to their Tuesday schedule. I picked up a second job cleaning offices at night after Emma went to sleep, leaving her with my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, one of the only people on that street who ever looked at me like a person instead of a problem. I sold my wedding ring. I sold Robert's truck. None of it was enough, because the hole he left behind wasn't the kind you could patch with overtime and second-hand jewelry money, and through all of it, Maple Grove watched, not with kindness, with curiosity, and then, slowly, with judgment. Marla Higgins, who lived directly across the street, had never liked me much to begin with. She ran the neighborhood association with the seriousness of someone managing a small country, and she made it clear early on that she thought Robert and I had gotten in over our heads buying a house on our income. When word got around about the debts, about the missed payments, about the notices that started showing up taped to my door, Marla stopped pretending to be neutral. She'd stand on her porch with her coffee and watch the mailman deliver my certified letters like it was entertainment. Denise Coleman, her closest friend, started referring to me as that poor Whitfield woman in a tone that had nothing poor about it. The worst part wasn't the whispering. It was the day Emma came home from school crying because a classmate, repeating something she'd heard from her mother, told her that her family was going to be homeless because her dad stole money. My 7-year-old daughter asked me if that was true, and I had to sit on the edge of her bed and figure out how to explain grief and shame and debt to a child in words that wouldn't break her. That night was the first time I let myself cry where she couldn't hear me. In the garage, sitting on an overturned bucket at 11 at night. Around that same time, I tried reaching out to Robert's family, hoping someone might help, or at least explain what had happened to him in those final months. His sister Carol answered the phone once, listened to me describe the debts, and the liens, and the strange withdrawals, and then said, flatly, "Robert always did have a habit of making messes and leaving other people to clean them up. I don't know what you want me to do about it." She never called again. I learned later that she'd known about at least part of what Robert was hiding, a gambling habit he'd developed after a knee injury sidelined him from the recreational league he loved. But she decided it wasn't her business to tell me while he was alive, and it certainly wasn't her business to help clean it up after he was gone. That silence hurt almost as much as the debt itself. It's a particular kind of loneliness, realizing that the people who are supposed to be your family have quietly decided you're on your own. The foreclosure notice came on a gray Thursday in March. I had fought it for as long as I could, working with a legal aid office that tried their best. But Robert's hidden debts had put liens on the house. That made the math impossible. The bank gave me 60 days. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at that letter, feeling something in my chest go quiet and cold, like a light switching off. I wasn't angry yet. I was just tired, the kind of tired that sits in your bones. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than I could process it myself. By the time moving day arrived, half the street seemed to already know, and some of them, instead of offering help or even simple silence, treated it like a show. That's the morning I told you about at the start. Standing on my cracked driveway with Emma's small hand in mine, listening to Marla and her friends laugh like my collapse was a punchline they'd been waiting to deliver. What none of them knew, what I barely let myself believe at the time, was that somewhere in the wreckage of Robert's secrets, there was a thread I hadn't pulled yet. A month before he died, Robert had mentioned, almost in passing, a name I didn't recognize, Harold Whitfield, an uncle of his who had passed away years earlier and left behind property somewhere in Ohio, according to Robert, who never seemed interested enough to follow up. I hadn't thought about that comment in months, but sitting in an extended stay motel room with Emma asleep beside me, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, something told me to search that name. It took weeks of digging. Phone calls to county clerks, faxes to lawyers who barely remembered the file, and a small inheritance tracing service I found through a legal aid volunteer. What I found changed everything, though not in the way you might expect. Not right away. Harold Whitfield had died 8 years earlier without children, and in his will, he had left a modest but far from empty estate to any surviving Whitfield family member who can be located. Robert had never claimed it, either because he never knew, or because, given how he'd been living those last 2 years, some part of him didn't want to be found by anyone connected to accountability. The estate had sat in probate limbo, gathering interest, waiting. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for a security deposit on a small rental house 2 towns over. Enough to pay off the last of the debts still chasing me. Enough, most importantly, to breathe. We moved to Centerville, a town 40 minutes from Maple Grove, close enough that I still recognized the highway signs, far enough that nobody there knew my name or my story. I took a full-time bookkeeping position at a growing landscaping company, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that let me actually plan a week ahead, instead of just surviving it. Emma started at a new school, and slowly, the fear in her eyes started to fade. I wish I could tell you the next years were easy, but that would be its own kind of lie. And this story isn't about pretending pain disappears just because the scenery changes. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table doing math that never quite worked out, nights I skipped meals so Emma wouldn't have to. I questioned whether I was strong enough to keep doing this alone. But something had shifted in me since that morning on the driveway. I had decided, somewhere between the humiliation and the exhaustion, that I would build something so solid, so undeniable, that no one would ever again get to laugh at what was left of me. The turning point came almost by accident. My boss at the landscaping company, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Nguyen, noticed how I reorganized the company's invoicing system without being asked, cutting late payments in half within 3 months. She started giving me more responsibility, then more, until I was essentially running the financial side of a business that was growing faster than its owner could manage. 2 years in, Patricia sat me down and said something I've never forgotten. "Diane, you don't work like someone who's just trying to get by. You work like someone building something." She offered me a partnership stake instead of a raise, structured so I could buy in slowly with sweat equity and deferred pay. I said yes before she finished the sentence. The company, Nguyen Grounds and Design, grew from 12 employees to over 60 in the following 4 years. We expanded into commercial landscaping contracts, then into design consulting for new developments across 3 counties. I won't pretend it was only my doing, because it wasn't, but I threw everything I had left into that work. Every ounce of the anger and grief and determination that had built up since the day I stood on that driveway, and it turned into something real. By the time Emma was starting high school, I was co-owner of a company doing 7 figures in annual revenue, and we had moved into a house I actually chose, in a neighborhood I actually liked, paid for entirely in cash. I tell you all this not to brag, because success that comes out of loss never really feels like winning, not fully. I tell you this because of what happened next, because this is the part of the story where the thread comes back around, the way it always seems to. It was early autumn, almost 9 years after that morning on Larkspur Lane, when I got a call from our office manager saying a woman named Marla Higgins was requesting a landscaping consultation for a property management company she was now working for. I almost didn't recognize the name at first, the way you sometimes don't recognize old wounds until they're standing right in front of you again. Nguyen Grounds and Design had a policy that senior partners handled larger commercial accounts personally, and this one, a mid-sized apartment complex needing a full grounds overhaul, fell to me. I drove to the site, meeting myself, and there she was, older, thinner, her posture different than I remembered, standing in the parking lot of a property that, I would later learn, she managed now only because her own real estate ventures had collapsed years earlier during an economic downturn that hit Maple Grove harder than most people expected. She looked at me for a long moment before recognition crossed her face, and I watched the color drain slightly from her cheeks. "Diane?" she said, like she wasn't sure the name still belonged to the woman standing in front of her. "Diane Whitfield." "It's Diane Reyes now," I said, using the name I had taken after remarrying 2 years earlier, calm, professional, the way I would greet any other client. "I understand you need a full grounds assessment." She stumbled through the meeting, glancing at my company polo shirt, at the branded truck parked behind me, clearly trying to reconcile the woman she remembered laughing about on her front lawn with the person now standing across from her holding a tablet full of landscaping contracts worth more than her annual salary. I gave her the same professional courtesy I gave every client, walked the property, took notes, discussed timeline and budget, and left without bringing up a single word about the past. But that wasn't the end of it. Word travels in small circles, even ones that have grown apart, and within a month, I started receiving messages, first from Denise Coleman, a careful, overly friendly text asking if I remembered her, wondering if I had any advice about getting into a stable career like landscaping consulting, then from 2 other former Maple Grove neighbors who had heard, through whatever remained of that old grapevine, that the Whitfield woman was doing well now. Then, finally, the knock I never expected. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my driveway helping Emma load boxes into her car for her sophomore year of college, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up along the curb. Marla stepped out, older still, dressed in clothes that looked like they were trying too hard to seem put together, and behind her, hesitating by the car door, was Denise. "Diane, I'm sorry to just show up," Marla said, Her voice, smaller than I remembered it, none of the sharp confidence from that morning on the driveway 9 years earlier. I didn't know who else to ask. I stood there for a moment, Emma beside me, watching the woman who once pointed and laughed at my collapse, now standing in my driveway with her hands clasped tightly together like she was holding herself steady. The apartment complex I was managing, Marla continued, it got sold to a new company. They let go of most of the old staff, including me. I've been trying to find work for 3 months. Denise told me your company might be hiring for office administration, and I thought, maybe. Since we knew each other back in Maple Grove, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say out loud what we both remembered. I could have said 100 things in that moment. I could have reminded her of the laughter on her lawn, of the way she pointed at my moving boxes, of the way she made sure the whole street knew about my husband's debts, before I'd even had time to process them myself. I could have told her exactly what it felt like to stand on that cracked driveway with my daughter's hand in mine, listening to her mock the worst morning of my life. Part of me, the part still carrying that old wound, wanted to. Instead, I looked at Denise standing awkwardly by the car, and at Marla's hands still clasped together, and I thought about Emma, who was 17 now, watching this entire exchange with quiet, careful eyes, learning something about how her mother chose to handle power when she finally had it. We do have an opening in administration, I said, finally. It's not glamorous. Filing, scheduling, some client communication. It pays fairly, and if you're good at it, there's room to grow. Marla's eyes filled with something between relief and disbelief. You'd really consider me? After everything? I'm not offering you this because of everything, I said. I'm offering it because you need work, and we need someone reliable in that role. What happened on Larkspur Lane doesn't go away just because time passed. But it also doesn't get to decide who I am now, and I'd rather build something than carry a grudge that only weighs me down. I watched something shift in her face, the way shame settles differently than gratitude, and for a moment I wasn't sure which one she was feeling more. He started the following Monday. It wasn't some fairy tale redemption where we became close friends who laughed about old times over coffee. It was quieter than that and more honest. She worked hard, kept her head down, and slowly, months in, she started opening up during slow afternoons about what had happened to her, how her real estate investments collapsed during a downturn no one saw coming, how her marriage had fallen apart under the financial strain, the same way mine once had, how she'd spent 2 years bouncing between jobs, hiding the truth from the same neighbors who used to hang on her every word. I used to think people who lost everything just weren't trying hard enough, she told me one afternoon, sorting through invoices at her desk. I didn't understand it until it happened to me. I'm sorry, Diane. I'm sorry for what I said, for what I let everyone say, back when you needed people to be kind, and we weren't. I didn't need the apology to feel complete. I'd already built the life I needed, brick by brick, without her permission or her approval. But I appreciated that she said it, and I told her so. Emma left for her sophomore year that fall, and on the drive back from dropping her off, I found myself thinking about that morning on Larkspur Lane, about the sound of Marla's laughter, about the sheriff's notice on the door, about the years of skipped meals and second jobs and quiet nights doing math that never worked. I thought about how easy it would have been to let that morning define the rest of my life, to let bitterness calcify into something permanent. And I thought about how, instead, piece by piece, year by year, I had built something that no one could laugh away, not because I set out for revenge, but because I refused to stay standing in that driveway forever. The house on Larkspur Lane is owned by someone else now. I drove past it once, a few years ago, out of curiosity more than anything. The new owners had repainted the shutters and replaced the mailbox. Life had moved on there the way it moves on everywhere, indifferent to the history it paves over. But I don't need that house back, and I don't need Maple Grove's approval anymore, because somewhere between the motel room and the inheritance search and the invoicing system, I rebuilt from scratch, and the partnership Patricia offered me when she saw something in me I hadn't fully seen in myself yet. I found something sturdier than a house. I found a version of myself that couldn't be foreclosed on. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: the people who laugh at your worst moment are rarely thinking about your future, because they don't believe you have one worth considering. Let them be wrong. Build quietly, build steadily. And when the knock finally comes, and it usually does, you get to decide what kind of person opens that door. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear which part hit hardest: the driveway, the discovery, or the knock at the door years later. Tell me in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that today's humiliation is not the end of the story, share this video with them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Legacy Whisper, because there are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about the quiet and glamorous, unstoppable rebuilding of a life that was written off far too soon. See you, take care.